Hi, I'm Joe Mimran, and welcome back to today's show. When you think of Canadian exports, your mind might drift towards oil, gold, maybe car parts, but I'll wager it doesn't land on cold water shrimp and turbot or halibut. Well, Baffin Fisheries is helping European and Asian markets discover these northern delicacies. This 100% Inuit-owned subsidiary of Baffin Fisheries was created to sustain fisheries resources for Nunavut. The company reinvests profits from the commercial offshore fishing industry back into the community to bolster the local economy. They're also working on ways to minimize their environmental impact at sea. Chris Flanagan is the CEO of Baffin Fisheries, and he and I sat down to chat about the state of Canadian fishing, the economic and climate hurdles it's facing, how things have changed, and how the appetites of foreign markets are shaping the future of this industry. I hope you enjoy. I'd like to begin today's episode by acknowledging that we're recording from my office in Toronto, which is on the traditional unceded territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We value taking this moment to deepen the appreciation of our Indigenous communities wherever we are and to remind ourselves of our shared debt to Canada's First Peoples. Welcome, Chris, and thanks for joining me. Before we get into Baffin, perhaps you can share a little bit about your background. I discovered prior to entering the corporate world, you were a business reporter, asking tough questions and doing hard-nosed reporting. What made you want to be answering questions rather than asking them?
Good question, Joe. That was back in the days of print journalism when people read newspapers. And unfortunately, as wonderful as the internet was, there was a clear indication in 1999, 2000 that newspapers were on the way down, really on the way out, I'll be honest. And so I got an opportunity to join the dark side, as we used to call it. And that was with CHC Helicopters. That was a growing company. It was really exciting. So I didn't have to think twice about that. And from there, I ended up in the fisheries. A long story, but it's great to be here.
So you've got a great background and you've taken on this, I would say, challenging role as CEO of Baffin Fisheries with all of its complexities and all of the good work that it does at the same time. Maybe you can take us through the original vision of the coalition that was formed and why Baffin Fisheries is so unique compared to other Canadian-owned fisheries, and also some of the challenges that come from remoting such a remote operation. So a lot of questions in that one question.
Sure. And I'll even answer with a different kind of an answer to start with. And that is that I'm really proud to work for an Inuit company. A lot of Canadians don't realize that it's 100% Inuit-owned and private profit-making, tax-paying, a lot of tax we pay when we're profitable, which is every year since I've been here. So it's a great success story. I get asked a lot of time, was that government? Is that funded? And no, it's not. We're a very proudly tax-paying, profitable, as I said, company. It started in 2001 as a coalition of all the smaller companies. And the vision was to create a company that was big enough to own assets. So in the early days of the fishery adjacent to Baffin Island, the companies would just basically take a royalty. So they would hire a southern company or an Icelandic company and just take a royalty. So it was generating some money for the communities, but not real ownership, not a lot of employment. And it was a great vision by many people in the Nunavut government and other private sector who put together the coalition. And the first mandate was to own vessels. And we now proudly have 3 vessels and are building a brand new 80-meter trawler, which will be the largest Canadian on-fishing vessel in the country. So very proud of that. And that's only in 20 years that they've come a long way. We've come a long way.
Yeah. And you've been with the company how many years, Chris?
7 years now.
And I noticed that you announced that vessel, that new $72 million vessel, I believe it is. It was announced, and that's going to be ready. When is that going to be ready?
Yeah, that's a great project, Zebs, thanks to some great funding from EDC and from Scotiabank. That's going to be ready in the summer or late spring of next year, of 2024. Now, there have been some delays. Tragically, the steel mill that was providing the steel was in Ukraine. And that steel mill was bombed on the first day of the invasion. So we did have a 3-month setback, but it's coming together now and starting to look like a vessel. So it is very exciting.
Yeah. I'm just trying to imagine a $72 million vessel. That's got to have a lot of high-tech qualities to it. And we're going to get into that a little bit because I do want to understand how you process right on that ship, because that's pretty interesting as well. But before we get into that, maybe you can explain how the quota system works. I know that there's been lots of issues that the Canadian fishing industry has had to deal with over the years, overfishing, environmental impact, all of that. Tell us a little bit about how the quota system works and who sets them. How do they monitor the setting of those? And then if you only have a limited quota, how does that sort of work into your ability to raise capital and do all the things you need to do from a financial standpoint?
You asked earlier how Nunavut quota was unique in Canada, and it really is. So our quota is co-managed by the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board and by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the federal government. And what makes it unique, and I think pretty special, is that Nunavut companies are judged on their performance every year under the Nunavut allocation policy. And so what the NWMB, that's the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board, does is they score us out of over 100 points on everything from sustainability to governance to environmental protection to economic performance. There's a lot of points in the system. And only if we perform well, and Inuit employment is another big one, only if we perform well do we get to keep our quota. Every 5 years, the company can theoretically lose almost all of its quota if it's not performing. And the basic measure is providing value and good governance to the beneficiaries under the Nunavut Land Claims Act. Those are our owners. And nobody else has that. All the other companies, they have to follow the regulations, the environmental regulations, but they don't have that extra step where they're actually scored in a report card and that where they reinvest the money is part of that score. So it is pretty unique. And then what happens is the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board makes either a recommendation if it's offshore or a decision if it's in the Nunavut Land Claims area, sends those to DFO, which either ratifies or even changes that decision. But it is co-managed, and it certainly keeps us on our toes. There's many times where we prefer not to have that system. And you mentioned, how do we raise capital? That's about the only time where we find the system a little bit too onerous. Because how do we go to the banks and say, we need to borrow $60 million? Oh, and by the way, if we slip up, we could lose all our quota and be bankrupt in a few years. So we have some great partners who took the time to see how the system works and looked at our track record and realized that this was a company that would continue to meet the standards of the NWMD.
So what you're saying is in 5 years' time, you've got this in the bag, so to speak. I mean, I can't imagine getting a loan knowing that the quota system might not be friendly towards you at the end of the 5 years. So I guess there's a huge amount of trust, but also you've got a track record that says that, hey, before you lose any quota, something pretty dreadful is going to have to happen.
That is true. We're 2 years in now, a little more than 2 years in. So it's only 3 years away until we have the next big allocation round. But in every single year, there's an annual report to do as well. So you get a report card in the interim years. It can't actually, if there's a real transgression, they can make a move in the middle years, but it's highly unlikely. And last time, though, there were 2 of the 4 Nunavut companies did in fact lose a large amount of quota for performance not coming to where the NWMB thought they were, which was, very unfortunate for them. But I think both those companies are much stronger now and better for it. So we do have, I think, a pretty good future going forward in Nunavut. Even in the Arctic, there's a tougher environmental regime there as well.
And so your last report card, you got what? Did you get like 99 out of 100? I mean, how did they rate you? Is it like A+?
I honestly can't remember the exact score because it's in 5 parts, but it's probably only in the 80s. We did, in fact, get some performance targets that, if not met, you face the risk of quota reduction in the next round. I'll be honest, one of them was Inuit employment. Inuit employment is very difficult because Transport Canada has strict requirements for working on board vessels, and Nunavut doesn't have a marine institute or a college that can provide all of the necessary requirements. So we have to identify the candidates, train them, and get them the sea time they need. So we're working on that. It's tough. We've got some great new second mates on the vessels now from Nunavut.
You're out there with the 3 vessels. You're catching a lot of fish. My understanding is it's something like annual harvest of 8,000 tons of turbot and 5,000 tons of shrimp. It sounds like a lot of product on 3 ships. And how long does it take to process that? Like, I would think you've got a window to do all your fishing in, right? And you're in pretty harsh conditions. Explain that a little bit. I think everybody would be pretty interested in knowing how that works? Like, are guys sleeping, guys and gals? I don't know if you have guys and gals on these ships. What's it like? How long do they have to be out in the water? What do they have to do when they're actually on these ships? And then how do you process all that food and get it to market?
Yeah, Joe, those are great questions. And it also answers the other question about why a boat would cost $72 million. And it's because of the processing that goes on board as well. So on a turbot trip, there are 28 crewmen, and unfortunately, all our crew members are men at the moment. We are trying to recruit women, but you can't just recruit one woman. I don't think you start with one. It wouldn't be a very good environment. So we're trying to recruit more than one at a time. First thing we have to do is get them to take the training and then recruit them to work for us. So that is a big challenge. An interesting thing about offshore trawlers is that the work goes on around the clock, but it's not 12-hour shifts, it's 6-hour shifts. So every fisherman works 6 hours on, 6 off, 6 on, 6 on. So they got to pack in 6 hours sleep, not 8. And it's the lifestyle that they're used to for generations. And when you're working on the line and you're, for example, working on a heading machine with the fish, or the gutting machine, or even packing, it's just too hard to do it for a 12-hour shift. So they do it for a 6-hour shift. And then they'll do another one in another 6 hours. Every turbot that comes on board is probably handled by about 5 or 6 men. And that's, but very carefully taking it off the first conveyor belt, putting it through a cutting machine for the heads and tails, bleeding them appropriately so that the meat stays fresh and they don't suffer. And then you've got sorting, weighing, then you put immediately frozen. So our fish is harvested, it's on the deck of the vessel, and then it's into the freezer within 4 or 5 hours. So it is very fresh product, and it's valued higher than non-frozen fish. All of our turbot is exported simply because the Europeans and the Asians will pay a lot more for it than the North Americans will. It's considered a high delicacy there, and it's very high in protein and omegas. It's a very healthy food.
And why is it more valuable than non-frozen? Is it just because you just flash freeze it immediately? So you always think of frozen as not nearly as good as non-frozen. Is it the travel time that non-frozen goes through that degrades the product? Why is that?
In China, for example, turbot is used in a lot of retail sales to make a family stew in the kitchen. And so it's great. They buy it and keep it frozen until it's needed to be used.
And so would you say Asia is your biggest market at this point?
Yes, it is. Yeah. A lot of the product that goes into Europe, for example, is smoked. Smoked turbot is very popular in much of Europe. And again, if it's still going to be processed in a smokehouse, then you're better off with a frozen product because they need it to sit in their inventory until they get it to the smoker. And oftentimes that'll take place in a smaller operation. So they do need to take the fish out of the freezer as needed.
Was Baffin Fisheries always involved in exporting? Did any of it at any time was for the domestic market, or was it always export-based business?
A lot of our shrimp was for the domestic market. That number has really decreased as the cost of feeding has gone up in Canada. And the turbot, really, there's just a few, if we sell 7,000 or 8,000 tons of turbot, it would only be a few hundred kilograms would be sold in North America. So a very small amount, but we are working on getting it into markets in North America, into restaurants. It's becoming an item that I just recently read is very popular in New York, and the New York restaurant scene is starting to come on board there. So we do hope and we plan to expand in North America, but we're not there yet.
And any advice to other firms that are looking to export? Any particular services or programs that you've been able to take advantage of that allowed you to grow the business and fund the business and get the help you needed to export to these countries?
Well, first of all, on the basic side, I would say CFIA, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, even though they're an inspection agency, they are a great assistance to companies getting into markets as long as you got your ducks in a row and your product is the highest quality as it needs to be. But also EDC has a new program where they will help us get into new markets. They may be in a position where they're a lender to a foreign buyer, for example, and they'll try to act as a matchmaker there. And it is great service. We haven't availed of it yet because we haven't started our own seafood marketing company yet.
And when you look at how much of the fish that you are now harvesting, what would you say the total amount is available within your region? Like if the quota, you've got a quota system, you're allowed, say, 8,000 tons a year. Is there 50,000 tons available? Is there 100,000 tons available? What's the total capacity that's available to be fished for turbot and shrimp?
The way shrimp works is they set a percentage of the biomass is the total allowable catch. And in general, it doesn't exceed 20%. So you don't want to catch more than 20% of the biomass. Now, shrimp is a little higher than turbot because shrimp reproduce maybe every 3-4 years. That's their lifespan. And in the areas we fish, it's probably in the 15 to 18% range because the northern shrimp fisheries are a little bit newer. They haven't gotten up to the 20% range, but we believe that's still totally sustainable. In Europe, there's some areas fish 30% of the biomass when it comes to shrimp.
Right. Now, I understand that some areas of the world, like the Mediterranean, is overfished and they've been depleting their fish there over the years. What say you? Are we in good shape here in Canada? Are the fisheries back to a sustainable position and one that will keep us for the long term?
Yes, yeah. This year, I'm also chair of the Fisheries Council of Canada. And so we spend a lot of time working on the reputation Canada has. And Canadian fisheries are, in general, very well maintained. DFO is a strict regulator. And across Canada, I can't speak to every region, of course, because I'm not involved in every region. But Canada has a great reputation and great track record with managing sustainable fisheries. And there's precautionary frameworks in most fisheries, and sustainability is absolute key. So shrimp, as I mentioned, is a percentage of the biomass is used as a measure. It's a little bit different in turbot because it's difficult to measure the entire biomass. But on the turbot fishery, it's certified by MSC, which is an international certification agency, which comes in, does independent audits to ensure that next year and 20 years down the road, there still will be fish and that it's being harvested at levels that ensure the species is maintained. So we're very proud of that. We think Canada is the leader in sustainability. The fisheries we're involved in are both MSC certified. I mentioned turbot, but shrimp is also MSC certified. We think there's lots of safeguards and measures in addition to those, as I mentioned, they're both co-managed in Nunavut. So we've got the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board takes yet another look at sustainability of fisheries.
That's wonderful. And in terms of the give back to community, you say it's a private organization and there's a lot of give back. What was the vision, the original vision, and how is that a priority for you and how is that managed?
Well, the vision was to deliver not just money and profits back to the communities, but as I mentioned earlier, jobs. So we do a lot of recruitment in the communities, but there's a third element as well, and that is socioeconomic development. So it's another thing that we're scored on in our allocation annual reports. And we invest money in buildings, for example. We've built office buildings in Pangnirtung, in Clyde River, in Pond Inlet. We're refurbishing a building in another community, Kimmeroot. We have a large office in Iqaluit. So we have the infrastructure we're starting to build. We help them build community freezers so they can store their other products that they hunt or fish. I'll tell you though, we've got a lot more to do. I mean, Nunavut really doesn't have the infrastructure that anywhere else in Canada does. So we're working on developing an inshore fishery, which was actually maybe a little bit more exciting for the owners of the company, the Inuit beneficiaries, because then they get to stay home.
That's such a good point. And global warming, what's been the impact of climate change to your industry in particular, and especially given where you're fishing? I'm sure you've heard from residents. What are you seeing?
So what we do is we swap some of our quota for some southern quota. We do a couple of swaps so that we can operate more year round. So we do fish off Labrador for a couple of months with some northern quota that we swap. And right now we've got a vessel off Labrador that can't really fish because most of it's still encased in ice. But they're saying, I'm no climate expert, but one of the reasons is ice is melting in Greenland. So you've got this super cooled water up in Greenland that circulates down off the coast of Labrador. And then it freezes a lot easier because it's coming down cold. So you got this oceanic cycle going on where the melting of the glaciers actually results in colder water off Labrador, more ice, tougher fishing. So it's been an odd one.
Yeah, I can't even imagine. I can't imagine those conditions and what you've got to do as a business to manage all that. And so I always ask this question of all my guests, what advice would you give to other companies that are looking to export? And now it might be specific to your industry, but is there any specific advice that you would provide?
I would say know your regulations and have staff that are skilled in administration. I guess the advice is that don't do what we're doing, do what we're saying, which is broaden your market. Look to a lot of markets and don't get trapped into just having one or two.
Yeah. And how would you do that if you wanted to go to Indonesia, Malaysia, some of these other markets? How do you plan on cracking those markets? Is it through the government? Do they assist you in terms of making connections, or do you go to trade shows? How do you crack those markets?
Yes, definitely trade shows first and foremost. So we have our sales team going to Barcelona, the International Seafood Show there at the end of April is a huge one. And face-to-face still means everything in sales. Now, Global Affairs Canada is extremely helpful. They have staff at the embassies in marketing who really know the buyers on the ground, and groups like EDC as well, which have special programs to help match you up with buyers who might be getting some Canadian financing. Great introductions there. Because really, we're competing against other companies that sell turbot or Greenland halibut and shrimp, but also we're competing in the whole protein market, right? So it's important to meet as many people and potential buyers as we can. We work with the embassies, with the trade commissions there. They've been extremely helpful, EDC, CFIA, and the trade shows.
That's wonderful. Well, I think you've done an amazing job from what I can see. It's an industry that I think we started off by saying pretty challenging in terms of the workforce, the requirements, all the regulations you've got to go through, and all the good work you're doing on behalf of the people of Nunavut. And, that's something that we're very proud of. Everybody should be proud of here in Canada. And to you for making that big switch from being the hard-hitting business reporter to a hard-hitting executive. We thank you for that. And you're doing an amazing job.
Thanks, Joe. This is the greatest job I've ever had. And I love working for the Inuit owners. I got a board of 10 elders, not always elders, but 10 hunters and trappers, really, from the small communities. And they're just such great people to work for. And looking really forward to going to Barcelona with our chairman from Clyde River in the next couple of weeks. It's been a great ride, and I hope it continues for a while.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. And wishing you all the best and lots of continued success, Chris. Thanks for joining us today on the Export Impact Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review on your favorite streaming platform. See you back here in 2 weeks.